Welcome to Chapter 1, Session 2A of this new class, the Book of Hebrews Restored. This segment is titled Introduction Part 2. In my last session, I was still in verse 1 and the first half of verse 2. Hebrews chapter 1:1. God, who at sundry times, or actually in various parts and in diverse manners, spake in time past unto the fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. That's the first half of verse 2. We had seen that John 1:18 was saying the same thing, that the Word of God was in the past spoken bit by bit, being revealed to the prophets in various ways, but then was brought all together, spoken by the Son of God. He delivered and demonstrated that word fully. He lived it so faithfully, he personified it. John 1:18. John 1:18 corresponds, no man hath seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, which is in the bosom of the Father, he hath hexagonomai fully declared him. So that fits with verses 1 and 2 of Hebrews. But I'm not done covering this. One of the other issues I mentioned last week was that both Hebrews chapter 1 and John chapter 1 have had orthodox theology imposed upon them. This theology was greatly influenced by Greek philosophy, which caused them to stretch word meanings and interpretations to favor their position. However, the word which was spoken to the prophets in time past in the Old Testament was understood Semitically, not in a foreign way. Moses eschewed Egyptian theology, and the 10 plagues each discredited Egyptian gods. So, how could any pagan theology be allowed in genuine Judaism? That foreign Greek influence was also detrimental to Christianity. But I told you that there were some individuals who went further and dared to change the text to support their position. And that is the case in John 1:18, where someone changed the word son, huios, into God, theos, to read the only begotten God. Wow. In the earliest manuscripts, the sacred names, called the nomina sacra, Wren reported on those during the Acts class. These sacred names, like Son, like God, like Spirit, like Christ, were all 2-letter abbreviations. And whoever changed Son into God changed Upsilon Sigma into Theta Sigma. This produced a contradictory term, only begotten God. But that showed up in the Nicene Creed that was produced by the Church Council in 325 AD, the same year Christianity was legalized in the Roman Empire. Well, what's an only begotten God? I thought that the very essence of our self-existent, all-powerful, and all-knowing God was that he also was eternal. So how could God be begotten? That implies there was a time when he was not. And also that he was not self-existent, because to be begotten means he had to come from somebody else. But I believe the original text read only begotten Son, and that poses no problem. For the Son was created by the Father and is subordinate to the Father. We read about that in 1 Corinthians 15. Look at 1 Corinthians 15, verses 27 and 28. For he, God, hath put all things under his, Christ's, feet. But when he, God, says all things are put under him, Christ, it's manifest, it's obvious, that he, God, is an exception, which did put all things under him. Because, if you delegate something to someone else, you've got to be greater than they. Verse 28, and when all things shall be subdued unto him, Christ, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him, God, that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. So, this establishes there in 1 Corinthians that the Son is indeed subordinate to the Father. However, the textual forgery of John 1:18 and the alternate understanding of monogenes, only begotten, is all part of a complex web of spiritualized deception that arose from Greek philosophy. So I'm going to need to take some time to disentangle things and to expose the systematizing of error that Ephesians 4:14 warned about. This will involve an analysis of the textual variations of John 1:18 and a review of how the book of Hebrews reveals the roles of the Son, and some church history regarding Arius and Athanasius, and the Council of Nicaea, and then we're finally going to dip our toe a little bit into the pool of Greek philosophy. So, in order to do so, we're going to have to put on our thinking caps tonight. So, back to John 1:18. There are some manuscripts that say only begotten Son, and then there are other manuscripts that read only begotten God. Now, this falls into the category of how the Bible interprets itself in the verse, just as it says. Because we have to figure out what does it say. Which reading is more likely original? To address this, we need to step into the realm of textual criticism. I taught a session on this in my Work in the Word class. For centuries, the Latin Vulgate had ruled, and no other Bible versions were allowed in the Roman Catholic Church. All attempts to translate the Bible into one's native language were crushed under penalty of death. But that began to change when a scholar named Erasmus published his Greek text. The printing press, using movable type, had recently been invented in Europe, and when Erasmus's Greek version was published, a revolution began. It was said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched in the Protestant Reformation. For when scholars saw the superiority of the Greek text over the Latin Vulgate, it spurred strides in the understanding of Bible interpretation, which inevitably led to the Protestant Reformation. Then, as the hunger for truth grew, a sequence of Greek scholars championed the cause of textual criticism, because as more and more ancient Greek manuscripts, as well as those in other languages, were discovered from library archives and monasteries all over Europe and the Middle East, these scholars analyzed this growing body of evidence. No originals have been discovered, but these manuscripts that existed did have variations, and so the scholars wanted to deduce what the original must have been. So they defined principles of basically manuscript detective work. And by the mid-1800s, 5 of the most ancient and complete manuscript codices, it's not a scroll, it's like a book, and they were unsealed, they were all caps. These important manuscripts became the standard for the critical text, and they are Codex Sinaiticus. This is a 4th century text. John 1 through 8 is in the Western text family, and the rest is in the Alexandrian text family. An indication of this in the apparatus is the Hebrew letter Aleph. Then you have Codex Alexandrinus. It's shown in the apparatus by the capital A. It is a 5th century Alexandrian text. The next one is Codex Vaticanus. It is shown as B, capital letter B. It's from the 4th century. It's an Alexandrian text family. Then the next one is Codex Ephemerae. This is shown by capital letter C in the apparatus. It is an Alexandrian or mixed text in those families. Then it's from the 5th century. The last one is Codex Bezae, and that is signified by letter D. It's a 5th century Western family text. So these 5 unsealed manuscripts shaped the critical Greek texts that were represented by what's in Berry's Interlinear. If any of you have looked at Berry's Interlinear, there is an apparatus at the bottom, and it footnotes which critical Greek texts support various readings, and the names of the critical Greek texts are abbreviated as G, L, T, TR, A, and W. Griesbach, Lockman, Tischendorf, Tregelles, Alford, and Wordsworth. And it uses Stephen's text in the main body from which the King James was translated. So it's a good reference book to have. It's available for free on archive.org, and you can get an idea of what textual criticism is all about. Well, these scholars analyzed the variant readings for John 1:18. Now, John 1:18 is missing from Codex Beza. There's some missing pages. But Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and Ephemerae read Only Begotten God. Codex Alexandrinus reads Only Begotten Son. But also there's other early languages that were translated from the early Greek texts that no longer exist, and they were translated in these other languages until the Vulgate took over and discouraged further revisions. And these other versions favor Huios, Only Begotten Son. These versions are the Curetonian Syriac, which is a Western text in Aramaic. It uses the ancient Estrangelo font, and it's from the 2nd century. It reads Son. The Armenian text is from the Caesarean family. It is a 4th century text. It reads Son. The Old Latin, which is before the Vulgate, is a Western text from the 4th century, much of it, and that reads Son. And even the Vulgate read Only Begotten Son. The vaunted Pshita text, the Aramaic, is actually a 5th century recension of the Byzantine text type, according to Dr. Arthur Vubis, and it reads God. So you see, a lot of the early texts, it represented on both sides. So by the time Berry's Interlinear was published, the consensus among the textual critics, GLT, TR, AW, except for TR for Tregelles, was still in favor of Only Begotten Son. This is probably because the Theos, Only Begotten God variant, was just from one text family, the Alexandrian text type, while Only Begotten Son was represented in more text families. It was more widespread. So it just didn't come from one place. See? And so anyway, only Tregelles favored God. The majority basically echoed the sentiment of Johann Griesbach, the G in GLTTRAW, who founded the science of textual criticism. And he devised a method that weighed the witnesses rather than just counting them. Because if you just wanted to count them, there are far more texts of the Byzantine text type than the others. However, all of those are late after the church councils. So, in this case, the vote of the majority is flawed. We all know that something's not true simply because more people believe it. Our mommies told us that. Also, Griesbach has this infamous quote regarding this subject in his 8th rule of textual criticism, which is, quote, among many readings in one place, that reading is rightly considered suspect, that manifestly gives the dogmas of the orthodox better than the others. Oh, Nelly. When even today, many unreasonable books, I would not say all, are scratched out by monks and other members devoted to the Catholic party, it is not credible that any convenient readings of the manuscripts from which everyone copied would be neglected, which seemed either to conform splendidly some Catholic dogma or forcefully to destroy a heresy. For we know that nearly all readings, even those manifestly false, were defended on the condition that they were agreeable to the Orthodox. And then, from the beginning of the 3rd century, these were tenaciously protected and diligently propagated, while other readings in the same place, which gave no protection to ecclesiastical dogmas, were rashly attributed to treacherous heretics. Unquote. Wow! The Orthodox hate that quote. And to this I add my report of an audacious example of this very thing in Revelation chapter 22. Please turn to Revelation chapter 22. This is shocking. Revelation 22:18 and 19. It says, for I testify unto every man that hears the words of the prophecy of this book, if any man shall add unto these things, God shall add unto him the plagues that are written in this book. And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part out of the book of life and out of the holy city and from the things that are written in this book. Wow, Nelly. But you know what? Some monkeyed with that text. They actually changed the word. Can you imagine that? In verse 22, they changed the word tree into the word book. The original text read xulu, tree, and they changed it to biblu, book. Do you know why? It was done to support the Roman Catholic doctrine of excommunication. Well, how brazen is that? I mean, that's worse than shooting yourself in the foot. It's like signing your own death warrant. That kind of blindness can only be via devil possession. But that's an example of how blind those were who intentionally changed the Bible to favor their theology. Well, holy concordance, Batman. That sure supported Griesbach's statement. But later, after Berry's Interlinear was published, papyrus documents began to be discovered, notably the Oxyrhynchus papyri that were excavated by Grenfell and Hunt in late 1896 or 1897, and the Bodmer papyri, including P66, was discovered in 1952, and P75 from around the same time. P66 is an Alexandrian text type on seal that reads Theos, God. And originally it was put forth as an early 3rd century witness. So it was earlier, they say, than Alexandrinus or Sinaiticus or Vaticanus. And that date was established upon the basis of its handwriting style. However, lately, that has been questioned by Brent Nongibri, who argued that when one takes into consideration the format, the construction techniques, and the provenance of the codex, along with the handwriting. He said it's more reasonable to conclude that the codex was produced in the earlier middle part of the 4th century. Then also, P75 is an Alexandrian text type, which also reads Only Begotten God. It originally was vaunted to be from the 3rd century, but also recent studies have adjusted that date into the 4th century. So with all those texts, we're back to where we started. All the witnesses are of similar age around the time of the 4th century councils. So, what we're left with among these manuscripts is a debate between textual scholars on both sides with equal initials after their names. Based upon the earlier dates for P66 and P75, the committee behind the United Bible Society's manuscript text voted for Only Begotten God, but there is a book that gives all of their deliberations. And in that book, Alan Wickren, one of the scholars, dissented, saying that Only Begotten God was a change from the earlier Only Begotten Son, and it was, quote, probably a transcriptional error in the Alexandrian tradition, because all of the ones that said Only Begotten God are all Alexandrian. And he lamented that a decision from Codex Beza was unavailable because there were missing pages. Beza was from the Western text family, which is a different family from the West. And if it had read Son, that would be a real decision maker, but there's missing pages, so we don't know. But this method of just dating the manuscripts is only 1/3 of hermeneutics, because what about the context or prior or other usage? In John 1, there's a repetition of the word monogenes, only begotten. And it's in verse 14 and in verse 18. So verse 14 signals that the use of that same word should be in 118 as well. So only begotten God does not fit. It must be about the same individual. John 1:14 and following is unmistakably concerning the Son of God. So 118 is going to complete that thought. That's what the context says. So that supports the textual option of Only Begotten Son. So you see how repetitions protect the word from misinterpretation? Wow. They're a lost mechanism of paragraphing. And when modern punctuation and paragraphing took over, repetitions dropped out of use. So that's why we don't recognize them when they're right under our nose. The context of the entire Gospel of John also supports this Only Begotten Son, because the stated purpose of the entire Gospel is concerning the Son of God. It even says so. Look at John 20, verse 30. And many other signs truly did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life through his name. Orthodox theologians even try to warp what the Gospel of John says to support their position, but I refute that in a chapter in my book, The Summer of Truth, because I go through the entire Gospel of John and show how the incidents portrayed do exactly what John 20, verse 30 and 31 says they do, that Jesus is the Son of God. So the Orthodox are trying to stack the deck, and I'm reshuffling it back in the proper order. But there's still the third principle of hermeneutics, and that is of prior or other usage. And for this, we turn to the book of Hebrews, because we've seen the relationship between John 1:18 and Hebrews chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. They're talking about the same thing. That is, a full portrayal of the Word is exemplified in the Son of God. And to further prove that, the verses following in Hebrews 1 repeat the word Son, as well as referring to the same beginning as in John 1:18. Ren's going to share those verses. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 5 also, for unto which of the angels said he at any time, Thou art my Son, this day have I begotten thee. And again, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And again, when he brings the first begotten into the world, he said, let all the angels of God worship him. So that ties in beginning with Son, doesn't it? Then after this, Jesus as the Son of God is repeated in chapter after chapter of Hebrews, building the themes of the book of Hebrews. In Hebrews chapter 2, verses 9 through 11, Jesus brought many sons to glory, and they are all one, for he's not ashamed to call them brethren. In Hebrews 3, 5 and 6, it's contrasting Moses being a servant over his house with Christ being a son over his house. And in Hebrews 4:14, Jesus, the Son of God, also was the high priest. And then in Hebrews 5, verses 5 through 8, Jesus is the obedient Son, becoming the author of our eternal salvation. And in Hebrews 7:3, Melchizedek is like the Son of God, made priest. And then Hebrews 7:28 says the Son is consecrated forever as the high priest. So this is what prior or other usage has to contribute to support the text that reads only begotten Son for John 1:18. And that's what I believe it should read. And then even beyond that are some of the other principles of hermeneutics. One such principle from my Work in the Word class is, quote, the interpretation and the application of a concept must always be in light of to whom it is addressed and which administration it resides, unquote. Well, part of the consideration regarding to whom it is written is that we must recognize the cultural elements that they would understand. The Hebrews definitely would not understand allusions to Greek culture. You know why? They strenuously resisted it. In fact, when a Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes, attempted the forceful Hellenization of Judea, you know what happened? The Jews revolted, and they fought so savagely, they won their independence from Antiochus Epiphanes. And the Maccabean kingdom resulted. So, not only did the Jews not understand Greek culture, they eschewed it. So I think it's folly to assume any Greek influence to have been possible in the book of Hebrews. Therefore, we must interpret the things in the book of Hebrews Semitically. When it comes to the term Son of God, considering it from a Semitic viewpoint opens up something beautiful. For to be the quote-unquote son of something or someone had both a figurative and a literal meaning. We know what the literal meaning is, but to be the son of some concept, figuratively, indicated a fathering process and a sonning process. It meant that one was fully committed to whatever cause, and they championed it, whether that cause was good or evil. On the bad side, the Antichrist is said to be the son of perdition, and those born of the adversary are called sons of Belial. On the positive side, Timothy was said to be Paul's son, and John Mark was said to be Peter's son. Well, they weren't related literally, but each of those championed what their father in the Word stood for. Angels also are called sons of God in this sense. So, and when the apostles were sent out two by two, Jesus instructed them to look for a quote-unquote son of peace. This was somebody in the community who actively worked for peace between quarreling neighbors, for instance. In our day, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was definitely a son of peace because he championed nonviolence. Jesus also was a son of peace, championing peace between us and God. In fact, he was the greatest son of peace the Prince of Peace. One of his titles in Genesis 49 also was Shiloh, peacemaker or peace bringer. So, as the Son of God, he championed the things of his Father. Jesus said the things that his Father told him to say. So he figuratively was a Son of God, as well as being literal. He did the things that his Father showed him to do. Because that's documented in John chapter 5. Look at John chapter 5, please. John chapter 5, verse 16. And therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day. Oh no, he healed somebody on the Sabbath day. Verse 17, but Jesus answered them, saying, my Father works hitherto, and I work. The Jews were angry with Jesus because he healed someone on the Sabbath day. Well, Jesus answered them, saying, my Father up to this point is working, and now I am working. The Greek emphasizes the I there because it's both in the suffix of the verb and in the personal pronoun. So Jesus was saying, look here, boys. God has been working, healing when he wants to, and now I am working. If God didn't want me healing on the Sabbath day, he wouldn't have energized it. Oh, well, hallelujah, Sakatuya. Verse 18. Therefore the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only had broken the Sabbath, but said also that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Wow. Well, are we going to let the theologians explain what that equality is? Or are we going to let Jesus explain what he meant? I think we'll follow what Jesus said. Verse 19 and 20. Then answered Jesus and said to them, verily, verily, I say to you, the Son can do nothing of himself, but what he sees the Father do. That's how we're equal. For what things soever the Father does, he does, these also does the Son likewise. For the Father loves the Son, and shows him all things that himself does. So if God wanted to heal that fella, he showed Jesus, we're going to heal that fella. And then Jesus said, and he will show him greater works than these, that you may marvel. Oh, wow. So you see how Jesus was the Son of God in both senses, figurative and literal. He figuratively was the Son of God because he followed what his Father showed him. He didn't do anything outside of that. But Jesus also was the Son of God literally, because God created the seed that conceived him in Mary. Well, you know what? Mary's egg had 23 chromosomes. Well, where did the other 23 come from? They were physically created in whatever God created in Mary so that there was a full fertilization of her ovum. So Jesus was the Son of God physically, because God had to create something in the physical realm to match with Mary's physical chromosomes. Hebrews talks about that later. But we're also sons of God according to 1 John 3:2, and that's spiritual. Beloved, we're the sons of God. Wow. Jesus also was born again spiritually when he was raised from among the dead. Jesus stated the rules concerning that in John chapter 3. And those rules apply to him also. Look at John chapter 3, verse 5. John chapter 3, verse 5. Jesus answered, verily, verily, I say unto you, except a man be born of water and of the Spirit, he cannot enter into the kingdom of God. Some people stop there and they say, you got to be water baptized. Whoa, wait a minute. Verse 6 clarifies, that which is born of the flesh is flesh, and that which is born of the Spirit is spirit. So, actually, born of water in verse 5 is not referring to water baptism. It actually is referring to the amniotic fluid which comes out during childbirth. How so? Because Jesus locked that understanding in with the A-B repetition in verses 5 and 6. So, A, born of water, equals A, born of the flesh, because both B's are equal, born of the Spirit, born of the Spirit. So you see how born of water has to be the amniotic fluid that happens when they're born of the flesh. See? So now we're ready to move on to the second half of verse 2 of Hebrews. We're ready to go. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2, B. Whom, talking about Jesus, he, God, hath appointed heir of all things, by whom also he made the worlds. The King James translators, as well as other versions, are content to mistranslate the word worlds, because it suits their Greek-infected theology. But we're not going to let them get away with that. They even interpret it as though it was singular. But the word worlds is not cosmos, which they suppose means that Jesus preexisted and was somehow involved in Genesis 1:1 creation of the world, singular. Oh, no. It's actually the word aion there, which means ages. It's not cosmos. Well, that's something different, and we're going to understand that Semitically, according to Moses and the real prophets, not according to Plato and Aristotle. I mean, the last time I checked, those two weren't prophets of the true God. Back in the 4th century, there was a great debate about these things, and the church councils hammered out their orthodox interpretations and excommunicated as heretics anybody who disagreed. Then they wallpapered over original Christianity with forged editions of the Bible, changing words as they wanted, did textual modifications that supported their doctrine. But actually, who were the heretics? Whoa, Nelly. The church councils came at a time of great change in Christianity. Emperor Constantine had seen a vision of the cross, which he thought helped him win a battle. He then legalized Christianity in the Roman Empire after it had been persecuted and not allowed to unify for 2 centuries. At this time, there was a debate going on in Christianity regarding Christology, championed by 2 advocates, Arius and Athanasius. So the Council of Nicaea was convened to establish which side was right. And they sent out invitations to attend all over the empire to bishops, and even throughout the Roman Empire to the west, and throughout the Parthian Empire to the east. But the invitations and the travel back moved faster in the west, which was by boat, and by east it took longer by caravan. And so they convened the Council of Nicaea when there was a predominant majority of people from the east, and people from the west, and they supported Athanasius and not Arius. So the deck was stacked. And then Emperor Constantine himself attended. Can you imagine? The emperor himself, how fearful. He had the purse strings for everybody, but he wasn't any theologian. He was a former pagan, and he was more familiar with that Athanasian doctrine that was influenced more heavily with pagan elements. But Constantine wanted to unify Christianity so it could be used as another arm of control over the populace. And so his presence intimidated the council to vote in favor of Athanasius, and Arius and his followers were excommunicated. Well, what were the doctrinal positions of Arius and Athanasius? They were basically debating whether God was the Trinity or not. The idea of a triune God was not new. It was an ancient doctrine common to many pagan religions, including the Egyptian religion, which Moses and Judaism eschewed. We've seen in the Acts class that the early Christians believed the same about God as the Jews. There is one God, not a three-in-one God. But in the next 2 centuries, while Christianity was persecuted by the Romans and not allowed to unify, more and more elements of Greek philosophy came into Christianity, and then when it became legalized, a huge influx of former pagan believers came in, bringing their former pagan beliefs along with them. And that overwhelmed Christianity. So, no wonder that the orthodoxy which resulted was riddled with pagan elements, including the Trinity. I mean, look, the same process contaminated the high and holy days of Christianity, Christmas and Easter. And we still have the proof of the pagan contamination today in the trappings of those holidays. Easter was infected by the pagan fertility festival at the spring equinox with eggs and rabbits. Christmas was infected by Saturnalia, the winter solstice, with mother and child worship, Christmas trees, mistletoe, etc., etc. So, if the high holy days of Christianity have been so affected, what about the rest? That's why we're cleaning house in the next Reformation. Hallelujah, sock it to you. Both Arius and Athanasius said that Jesus was the only begotten Son of God, but they disagreed about what that meant. Arius said that because Jesus was begotten, he was created at a point in time. So, Arius said there was a time when the Son did not exist. Arius maintained that the Son was, quote, not eternal or co-eternal or equally self-sufficient with the Father, unquote. As a consequence of that, Arius concluded that Jesus was subordinate to God, having received his powers from him, like we read in 1 Corinthians 15. But the Council of Nicaea disagreed, saying that somehow the Son was not created, even though the Bible says he was begotten. Duh. So they came up with the idea that he was, quote unquote, eternally begotten, unquote. What the heck is that? It's just mystery talk, a contradiction that the Trinitarians use whenever something doesn't make sense. It's a contradiction they consign to their mystery locker. The Orthodox believe that he is the way they say he is, but they can't fully explain why he is one God in 3 co-equal persons. But we, in original Christians, believe what the Bible actually says in Hebrews 1:2b. God appointed Jesus heir of all things. Well, if that's so, then there was a time that he wasn't the heir. Isn't that logical, based on what it says? And we in the original Christians also believe what the last part of verse 2 says. By whom Jesus also, he, God, made the ages, not the worlds. And this is where original Christianity agrees. This is where original Christianity disagrees with both Arius and Athanasius. Because by the time the Greek philosophical concept of the Logos doctrine had infiltrated Christianity, both Arius and Athanasius believed it. But the Logos doctrine is Greek philosophy. It's not Semitic. Besides, verse 2 does not say that by Jesus God made the world, singular, like what the Logos doctrine says. The Greek philosophers conceived of a supreme God who was so perfect he could not move. For if any change occurred, that would simply imply that what existed before wasn't perfect. So the philosophers called this supreme God the immovable mover. Another contradiction. And you can look that up on the internet. But how then could God do anything if he couldn't move? So the philosophers cooked up another concept they called the Logos. They said that this Logos, or wisdom or reason, was an alive, intermediary being through whom God did all his dirty work. So God never changed. They say God created the world by means of this Logos fella. And that fit their needs nicely. But you know what? They failed to explain where the Logos guy came from. This is what was believed in Greek culture, in which the words of the philosophers were like scripture to them. So when these Greek folks became Christians, they wanted to bring this thinking in with them. But while Paul was still around, he fought against it. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 verse 17. He said, "For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us who are saved, it's the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will bring to nothing the wisdom of the prudent." Well, what wisdom do you think he was talking about? The Greek wisdom there at Corinth. Where is the wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the disputer of this world? Hath not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? So what wisdom was Paul railing against? The very Greek wisdom I'm talking about. 1 Corinthians 1:21-4. After in the wisdom of God, the world by bare wisdom knew not God. So it pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe. For the Jews require a sign, and the Greeks seek after wisdom. But we preach Christ crucified, unto the Jews a stumbling block, and unto the Greeks foolishness, but unto them that are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because you know what? The foolishness of God is wiser than man, and the weakness of God is stronger than man. But when both branches of the church fell apart, after Paul was jailed, and the temple was destroyed, and the Roman persecutions ensued, there was no way to fend off the encroachment of foreign ideas. And soon, the church was full of divisions, sects, branching off with their own doctrines. And the ones who finally won all the arguments got to rewrite history the way they wanted, and they erased the others. So we ended up with the Orthodox Christianity and no other stuff to look at. Now, the book that I keep bringing up helps you understand this, The Influence of Greek Ideas Upon Christianity by Edwin Hatch. It explains how Greek philosophy hijacked original Christianity. Then there's another book by Adolf Harnack named The History of Dogma. And he says that there was even a time when those who resisted the invasion of Greek philosophy were called the alogi, the unlogos, theological. And they were Joe and Jane Believer, the real believers. And they were esteemed ignorant by their own educated bishops. And so their original Christian beliefs were declared irrelevant. The Greek philosopher Christians read what Plato and Aristotle said into John 1 and Philippians 2 and Hebrews 1, when those passages originally were not supportive of Greek philosophical concepts. So now, today, Orthodox thinkers read the same Greek concepts into Hebrews 1. But wait a minute. Who was Hebrews written to? Weren't they the same believers who defeated Antiochus Epiphanes when he attempted to Hellenize Judea? Weren't they the same Hebrews who Josephus said that they believed that teaching their children Greek was equal to feeding them pork? Weren't they the same Hebrews who were so resistant to Roman influence that they sacrificed themselves when Herod tried to put a Roman eagle on the top of the main gate of the temple? These were the same ones to whom Hebrews was addressed. So do you think for 1 minute that they would stand for any imposition of Greek philosophy, doctrine in the introduction of this letter to them? It would have caused a riot. The book of Hebrews would have been torn up, and we never would have heard of it. Instead, the Orthodox victors ripped up the books of the original Christians and erased them from history. And by the time of the church councils, nobody was accurate. They all were contaminated. Both Arius and Athanasius' interpretations violated what chapter 1 really says, because both of them were already infected with foreign Greek stuff. Wow. So there's got to be a non-Greek way to understand this, a Semitic way. And there is, if we let the book of Hebrews explain itself. Well, how do we do that? Remember, hermeneutics has 3 principles. The word interprets itself in the verse, in the context, or in prior or other usage. The theologians may crow about what the lexicons can mean, but the context can identify what they do mean. And since this is in the introduction of the book, and we've seen the themes echoed in the conclusion of the book, it's logical to look in the main body of the book to further explain what was being introduced in the beginning. That's exactly what the book of Hebrews does. It talks about these ages, Ion. What are those ages? They are the administrations in the Bible. These ages are explained further in Hebrews 9:26 and Hebrews 11:3. Hebrews 9:26. For then must he often have suffered since the foundation of the world, cosmos. There it is, cosmos. But now, once in the end of the world, Ion, hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. Well, wait a minute. Was it the end of the world when Jesus did that? No. And has to mean something else. In the consummation of the ages, that's what it means. See? And that happened when Jesus was crucified. That was that made everything happen. Then chapter 11, verse 3. Through faith we understand that the worlds, ages, again, Ion, were framed, repaired by the word, rhema, of God, the individual spoken words of God, so that things which are seen were not made of things which do appear. So the new stuff came out of thin air. Ion is also used 7 more times of Jesus in the book of Hebrews, saying he's a priest forever. But that's actually unto the ages. Well, what ages is it talking about? All the administrations to come. But some say, that's not enough of a connection. But wait, these ages are linked to another concept in Hebrews 11:3, the rhema of God. And those individual spoken words of God are a major theme in the book. Hebrews chapter 1 is full of decrees from God that were given at pivotal points in Jesus' ministry. Ren's going to read that. These inaugurated time periods, which were phases of Jesus' ministry, as we proved in our 4 witnesses of the Messiah class. Later, in the book of Hebrews, is a major subject concerning the different kinds of heavenly declarations that certified Jesus to be a high priest. God said it. God called him to it. God testified it. God swore it. These oracles of God are even said to be the founding principles. In my Pentecost 2024 teaching, I gave a thorough overview of the subject, proving the legitimacy of dispensationalism and talking about the ages that were made. God structured them around his Son. And as Hebrew 9 declares, Jesus consummated them when he sacrificed himself. I came to understand all of that way back in 1983. And there's a story behind that. I was on the research team in the former ministry, and one of my assignments was to improve the Jesus Christ is Not God book. I actually added 100 pages to that book, in what would have been the 3rd edition. I strengthened some arguments. I added a chapter about if Jesus is not God, then who is he? And I added a lot of footnotes. But Dr. Werwolf passed away before he had approved all my changes. So I guess it was never publicized. Then all the people who were on the research team left that ministry, and the 3rd edition was Deep Six along with a bunch of other things. But I was hung up in that 3rd edition with Hebrews 1:2, because the position in the 2nd edition was that Hebrews 1:2 originally did not read, quote, by whom he made the ages, but instead it read, quote, on account of whom God made the ages. The difference is in the case of the object, the preposition dia. If the object is genitive, then it means by means of. If the object is accusative, it means on account of. Dr. Werber proposed that it should be accusative. That would be dihon in the Greek. But there is no manuscript that reads that way. All the manuscripts in existence read dihu, genitive. But there was one scholar who proposed that it could be accusative. And believe it or not, that guy's name was Grotius. Oh, I sure hope his other name was not Maximus. But anyway, there was a critic who wrote us a letter bugging us for proof of that accusative case reading. It was written by one of those folks who are always digging up dirt to tear down our ministry. And I was peeved at him. And I wrote him back, and I did not say some nice things. I'm sorry about that now, because I have a greater understanding from Romans 14 on how to treat our Christian brothers, even if we disagree on stuff. But you know what? It still bugged me, because I'm an honest researcher, and I'm willing to ask myself, well, what if I'm wrong? So I double and triple check things, because I want to be right. And often when I do so, I understand things better. I also consider others' viewpoints and often see where they went wrong. And that helps me teach stuff better, because I can warn against their missteps. So the proposal was without proof that it had to be accusative case, dihon. And that bugged me. Well, that fella's reproof didn't have his intended effect, because it spurred me to work it deeper, and then I was able to understand it with the genitive by whom. And out of that came a purple smoke moment when I realized that worlds was ion, and that ages, and that each of the dispensations began with phenomenal audible words from the spiritual realm into the physical realm. Words in concretion that anybody could hear even if they didn't have spirit upon them. So, how did Jesus make the ages? By whom? Jesus, well, Hebrews 9:26 said so. He consummated them. Plus, I found that there were different ways to express agency in Greek. There's the dative of means, or the prepositions en, or dia, or hupa. And I found that there is a difference between dia and hupa. Dia is used when more than one person is involved in bringing something to pass. Hupa is used when there is a sole agent. But Hebrews 1:2 is not hupa, because there were more than Jesus involved in making the ages. Because what if Abraham didn't leave Ur? Or what if Moses turned God down? Or what if Mary told the angel, "You want me to do what?" A team of believers was involved, and Hebrews 11 lists many of them. If we were to say Mickey Mantle won the game by a walk-off home run in the 9th inning, we would use Hoopa. The game was won by Hoopa, him, sole agent. But if we were to say the game was won by the team working together, we would use Dia. So Jesus wasn't the sole agent by which the ages were made. But he was pivotal, as Hebrews 9:26 declares. If one lists the 7 administrations, they form an introversion. A, B, C, D, C, B, A. With the middle D term being the gospel era, because everything hinged on that. Had Jesus failed in his mission? Had he taken up Satan's offer of all the kingdoms of the world? Or had he decided against doing God's will in Gethsemane? Or if he had called those 12 legions of angels to take him down off the cross, then all of God's preparations and everything the believers did would have been for nothing. But Jesus obeyed and accomplished his mission, and after that, all the rest of the coming ages became a foregone conclusion. Hallelujah. This is exactly what, quote, upholding all things by the word of his power is talking about in verse 3. Upholding is pharaoh. That means to bring into legal and binding effect. Jesus consummated the ages. And it was for, dative case, indirect object, God's powerful rhema. It was for the sake of all those words that God had spoken to bring the administrations to pass. That meaning for Pharaoh is echoed later in Hebrews 9:16. So what rhema words were those? They were the phenomenal audible heavenly declarations which inaugurated each dispensation. They were the rhema of God that they were used to repair in Hebrews 11:3. So, I've just shown you another way, an accurate way, an original Christian way of understanding the introduction of the book of Hebrews. It has nothing to do with Greek philosophy. Those are tough words, but they are 100% true. I've gone a little long here. I have a couple more pages, but I think I'm going to defer them to next week because I've been taking you through step by step, explaining things as simply as I can and corroborating it with logic and scriptures. But there's been a lot to deal with because this stuff is a theological minefield. But I think it's very clear that back in the 1st century, the Hebrews surely would have rejected the Greek philosophical concepts that ended up creeping into the church 100 years later. So here we are, out of time, and I'm actually not done with verse 2.